Ooh, that's a very vast topic because it encloses several priorities. One of the most critical one, which I have been dealing with and addressing, is green hydrogen is essentially about an energy transition. And when you talk about, because of the scale, it's a game changer. I had mentioned it before. And because of that dimension, it has tremendous geopolitical implications. And that, of course, has a tendency to influence on the margin of maneuver, on what governance can do to try to alleviate strategic issues that are involved in a transition from, let's say, a fossil-dominated world into a renewable, sustainable energy dominated one, of which green hydrogen is, I believe, an enabler because it will scale massively the amount of renewables that will be required. And I've been dealing personally with wind energy for the last, my first wind turbine, I think it was Morocco's first, was erected in Dakhla in 1994. And the challenge there was already, we had lots of wind resource and we had low demand. And I think the key back then was to both try to connect this resource to the rest of the grid, the national grid of Morocco. And I had the privilege to report on these prospects at very high level. And the second challenge was to find local uses for very cheap and available wind electricity locally. And so back then, the first reflex, because the wind turbine was installed on an agricultural farm that was using water that was pumped from a fossil aquifer, was to look into wind energy for desalination in order to support sustainable agricultural operations. And I think that is a theme that is now being pursued massively at much larger scale. My first wind turbine was compared to the state of the art of the time, which was 50 kilowatt. Now I know there is a 50 megawatt project by Dakhla that looks precisely into producing massive amounts of desalinated water from wind to feed about 5,000 hectares. I think it's 10,000 jobs for producing high cash crops. And I'm really pleased to see that this can be made possible without any subsidies, because the price of desalinated water from wind, from a sustainable source, is covered by the production of anything that can be produced there at a high value. So it has taken, I think, from 94 to now, 30 years, for that to concretize. And I know that Agadir is already operational for quite some time, the largest one of Morocco's largest desalination plant. And I know that the big share of that plant, half of it, goes to Sousmassa for agricultural operation. And because you're feeding desalinated water in an agricultural zone, you also contribute to recharge the aquifer, which has been severely depleted because of the droughts. So this is the first, let's say, low-hanging fruit that could be derived from wind energy. Now, the second low-hanging fruit was obviously looking at how green electrons could be fed into the national grid of Morocco. We know that we can produce very cheap amounts of wind electricity on the Sahara coastline because of the trade winds. But the load center of Morocco are located 1,000 kilometers further away in Casablanca, Kenitra, Tangier. And so we have a 1,000-kilometer gap that we need to bridge. And in order to bridge that gap, there is only one technology available in terms of green electrons, which is the high voltage direct current line. And unfortunately, this technology is it's the same investment for 1 gigawatt or 5 or 10 gigawatt. And so when you build a corridor that long, you want to make sure that you can optimize the investments on the price of electricity that can be delivered to our load centers. And because of the grid, I presented this project in 2002 at the European Parliament, feeding green electrons to Europe, very cheap. The problem back then is that Morocco could not absorb it, and so the idea was to have a regional dispatch. Some of it could be exported to Europe, and some of it, most importantly, feed and support Morocco's load center. So if we're talking 2002, the peak load or even the installed capacity was around 4 gigawatts, and the project was already 5 gigawatts. So it's just to show you the problematic, technically driven of the scale of high voltage direct current transmission, and the lack of load in Morocco, and the lack of willingness in Europe to absorb very cheap electrons generated at record low cost, because Spain had its own power base that was mostly gas-fired. And if you bring green electrons very cheap to Spain, Spanish companies will say, wait a minute, I invested in a gas turbine and I'm selling electricity from gas. If you are feeding cheap green electrons to the Spanish grid, I'm going bankrupt. And this has been also the case with the Spanish renewable energy program, mostly driven by wind and later solar, where in fact gas-fired power plants went pretty much bankrupt, had to be supported by the state because they were not running long enough to pay back for their investments. So I know it's a long process, it's a long road. Hydrogen is a game changer, because when you talk about the production of green hydrogen, which is a component we've added in our project from 2005 onwards, and with support from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, co-funding from them and the State Department support, and France, I think Germany and UNIDO supported us on that as partner countries, to try and develop a green hydrogen component which will enable to decouple the demand for green electricity not only on the Sahara coastline, but also on Morocco's main phosphate hub in Jof Lasfar, but also enable also a green transition to be decoupled in Europe, mostly Spain and Portugal and Germany. So the idea is, with the decoupling of the demand for green electrons for electrolysis in Europe, then there is, we're talking about a factor of 10 times more electricity than from renewables than what existed before. So with that, you're changing completely the dynamics, and you enable, most importantly, to develop an integrated approach with the help of, let's say, Morocco's needs for green ammonia, for example, to have an integrated approach in order to access wind electricity and enable cheap wind electricity and solar combined to be fed into Moroccan load centers. So you can see the synergies between cheap green electricity, the needs of OCP, and most importantly, if you are feeding Morocco's load centers with cheap green electricity, Morocco is industrializing. We know that the competitiveness of industry is closely related to the price of electricity. Then we have essentially contributed significantly to the industrialization of Morocco and the development of a vast renewable energy and green hydrogen industry. Well, the particularity, of green hydrogen is the biggest, the Trump advantage, is a Trump card. The Trump advantage of Morocco is precisely the trade winds that are blowing on a very long distance over the Sahara coastline. And so that is a key advantage, because when you are generating green hydrogen, you rely on very expensive electrolyzers. And if you want to generate a green ammonia, you have Haber-Bosch reactors that are also very expensive. So those are downstream equipment that need to run 24/7 in order to pay them back. And so if you have only solar energy at your disposal to generate green hydrogen, you're able to run these operations at, let's say, 23%, 25% load factor, which is the load factor of solar energy. If you are able, like is the case in Dakhla, Boujdour, as we can see with the recent projects, to generate wind electricity at over 60% load factors, even beyond, I think Dakhla is even close to 70%, and you add 23% of solar, that means not only are you able to generate green hydrogen at very low cost because your machines downstream will be operating pretty much continuously. And that's a key economic advantage. It's not the only one. The second key economic advantage is obviously the fact that Morocco is very close to a huge hydrogen market, emerging market, where Europe is probably one of the key drivers. Because of that proximity, you will be able not only to generate green hydrogen at record low cost, but to deliver it to the markets via pipelines. And Morocco is also blessed by having salt caverns. 82% of Morocco's butane since 1978 is being stored in salt cavern by Mohammedia. So we have an experience in storing gases in salt caverns for a long time, as you can imagine. But those are embedded layers, so 400 meter deep, 100 meter thick. So we know that we can store some hydrogen in the Mediouna Basin, which is 10,000 square kilometer big. It's very big. But most promisingly, you have in Essaouira, and I've been involved in a study for Mazen, funded by the World Bank, I identified salt domes. And currently in the world, there is 4 salt caverns that store hydrogen. 3 of them are located in Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico, and they enable massive storage of hydrogen. It's gray hydrogen for refineries and ammonia production. But in the case of Morocco, we can store massive amounts of green hydrogen in the salt domes of Essaouira and then feed from the Sahara a pipeline. We can store them in Essaouira and then feed the operations of Georges Lasfar, and most importantly, feed further on, thanks to the GME gas pipeline, which is no longer used, we can feed European markets as well. So we have an integrated approach where we can generate cheap hydrogen on the Sahara coastline, store it, deliver it to OCP's operation, and feed Europe along the way. I'm saying this is critical because hydrogen, the main challenge of hydrogen, of green hydrogen, is the storage. If you are capable of storing green hydrogen, that means you can deliver it on demand. And what we have in Morocco is, as well as for the solar and for the wind, our peak generation season is in the summer. And we know that in Europe, the peak demand for green hydrogen follows peak demand for electricity, obviously, which is the winter. And so if you're able to deliver on demand, to generate in the summer, store it in the salt domes by Essaouira, and then feed European markets where you have the higher prices, then it's a tremendous advantage that you have. And you have, at the same time, developed an integrated approach with the ecosystem that OCP is likely to roll out, to be able then to have an integrated approach, enabling our country to be a major player, I believe, a major actor in the energy security of Europe, which is what NATO was interested in from the very beginning. So it took some time. We started with OCP and NATO in 2006. It took some time until this project concretized. This has nothing to do with Morocco. It has to do with the policy of NATO in the 2010, where actually this energy strategy of NATO was being reconsidered. And there were a group of high-level experts composed by major oil CEOs, BP, Shell, etc. And they decided that this energy strategy of NATO would rely on the NATO-Russia partnership. That's critically important because they invited President Medvedev in 2010 in Lisbon, at the Lisbon summit, and they mentioned this is the strategy. So I knew back then that we would be delayed tremendously in rolling out these prospects. And as we can see, this strategy was obviously short-sighted because with the current supply problem that NATO countries, particularly European NATO countries, are confronted with, alternatives need to be developed to diversify away from a high dependency of Europe, particularly Germany, to Russian gas. That's why I believe that not only is the policy of Germany and that of the United States and that of Morocco and that of Spain aligned with these prospects, but also believe that some countries along the way, if not France, then Italy would be also interested in becoming a transit country to feed green hydrogen into the main load center of Europe, which is still located around Germany, if there are some problems with France.